Marcus Thompson had always prided himself on being prepared for anything. The basement of his suburban Denver home was stocked with enough canned goods to feed his family of 5 for months, and his gun safe contained enough ammunition to outfit a small militia. What Hae hadn't prepared for was the way his neighbor, Harold Brennan, would use the chaos of the outbreak to settle old scores and seize control of their entire neighborhood. The first reports came through the emergency broadcast system on a Tuesday morning in October. Marcus was getting his coffee ready when the familiar tone interrupted his morning news program. "This is not a test," the robotic voice announced. "Citizens are advised to remain indoors and avoid contact with infected individuals." His wife, Janet, emerged from upstairs, her nursing scrubs still wrinkled from her overnight shift at the Denver General. As had seen things during her shift that the news wasn't reporting yet, patients arriving with bite marks, aggressive behavior that required restraints, and a medical staff increasingly overwhelmed by something they couldn't understand or treat. "We need to get the kids," Janet said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Their 3 children, 16-year-old Emma, 14-year-old Tyler, and 12-year-old Sotha, were all at different schools across the district. Marcus grabbed his keys and headed for the door, but Janet caught his arm. "Marcus, you don't understand. If I was seen what these people become. We can't just drive around the city like nothing is happening." As Hae pulled out her phone and showed him a video one of her colleagues had sent. The shaky footage showed something that had once been human, its movements jerky and unnatural, pursuing a terrified orderly down a hospital corridor. By noon, the situation had deteriorated rapidly. The schools had gone into lockdown, but parents were being told to wait for official guidance before attempting to collect their children. Marcus paced their living room, watching the news covered with growing alarm. The official reports spoke of civil unrest and isolated incidents, but the amateur footage streaming across social media told a different story. Videos showed people stumbling through streets, their movements wrong somehow, pursuing others with shingle-minded determination. Harold Brennan appeared at their door around 2 o'clock, flanked by 2 other neighbors Marcus barely knew. Harold had been a problem since the day the Thompsons moved in 5 years ago. A retired police sergeant with an inflated sense of authority, had appointed himself the unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator and had been a constant source of complaints about everything from Marcus's lawn maintenance to the volume of their children's outdoor play. "We're organizing a community response," Harold announced without preamble. "I'm taking charge of neighborhood security until the authorities get this situation under control." Marcus felt his jaw tighten. "Nobody asked you to take charge of anything, Harold." But even as Hae said it, Hae could see the other neighbors nodding along. Fear had made them willing to follow anyone who had projected confidence, even someone as consistently disagreeable as Harold Brennan. "Look, Thompson, I know we've had our differences, but this is bigger than petty neighborhood disputes. We need to pool our resources and coordinate our response." Janet joined them at the door, and Marcus could see her assessing the situation with the same clinical eye as Hae brought to her nursing practice. "What exactly are you proposing?" Hae asked. Harold smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Simple. We establish a perimeter around the neighborhood, set up checkpoints, and make sure everyone contributes to the common defense. Your husband here has quite the arsenal in his basement, that is going to be community property now." The presumption of it left Marcus speechless for a moment. "You want me to just hand over my guns to you?" Harold's expression hardened. "I want you to contribute to the common good. Unless you think you're better than the rest of us." The 2 men flanking Harold stepped closer, and Marcus realized this wasn't really a request. It was an ultimatum delivered with the veneer of community cooperation. "We need time to think about it," Janet said diplomatically. "And we need to get our children home safely first." Harold nodded, but his smile remained cold. "Of course. Family first. But remember, Thompson, we're all in this together now. And some of us have more experience with crisis management than others." As they walked away, Marcus caught Harold's parting words to his companions: "Don't worry. Hell'll come around. They always do when they realize they don't have a choice." The afternoon brought news that would change everything. The school district had officially closed all facilities, but parents were being directed to designated pickup points rather than the schools themselves. Marcus and Janet decided to retrieve their children together, leaving their home secured but knowing they'd have to deal with Harold's demands when they returned. The drive across town revealed the true scope of the crisis: abandoned vehicles, emergency responders overwhelmed, and an increasing number of people moving through the streets with that same disturbing, unnatural gait they'd seen in the videos. Emma was waiting at the high school pickup point, her usual teenage composure cracked by obvious fear. As had been one of the last students to be collected, and her account of the day painted a picture of institutional collapse. They kept waiting the gym for hours, as had told them as they drove to collect Tyler. Some of the teachers never came back from their lunch break. Emma Peterson, our principal, just disappeared around noon. The substitute teachers and coaches were trying to keep everyone calm, but you could tell they didn't know what was happening either. Tyler's middle school had been even more chaotic. The basketball coach who had been coordinating the pickup process looked exhausted and overwhelmed. "Thank God you're here," he said when Marcus and Janet arrived. "We've got maybe 30 kids left, and I'm not sure how much longer we can maintain order." Tyler climbed into their car with his usual quiet resilience, but Marcus could see the stress in his son's posture. "Dad, are we going to be okay?" It was a simple question that Marcus wished he could answer with certainty. The elementary school where Sofa attended had been the most organized, but also the most frightening. The principal, Mistress Rodriguez, had clearly been preparing for the worst. "We've had 3 teachers fail to report for duty," as he told them quietly. "And we've had to turn away several parents who were behaving strangely. I'm not sure what is happening out there, but I know it's not good." Sofa ran to them with obvious relief, and Marcus felt his heart break a little at how scared his youngest daughter had been. The drive home took twice as long as usual. They had to navigate around roadblocks, abandoned vehicles, and increasingly chaotic traffic. Janet monitored the radio, switching between emergency broadcasts and news stations, trying to piece together what was actually happening. The official reports were still sanitized and vague, but the reality was becoming impossible to ignore. People were changing, becoming something else, and traditional authority structures were crumbling under the weight of a crisis no one had anticipated. When they finally pulled into their driveway, Harold Brennan was waiting for them with a larger group of neighbors. Marcus counted at least 8 people, including the Gansens from 2 houses down and the elderly Peterson couple from across the street. Harold's expression was grim but satisfied, like a man who had been proven right about something he'd long suspected. "Thompson, we need to talk. The situation is deteriorated while you were gone." Janet stepped out of the car first, positioning herself between Harold's group and their children. "What has happened?" as he asked. Harold gestured toward the main road that connected their subdivision to the rest of the city. "We had visitors. 3 of them, moving house to house, trying to get inside. They weren't normal." Peterson here put on a down with his deer rifle. The elderly man nodded grimly, his hands still shaking from the experience. "The point is," Harold continued, "we can't wait for the authorities anymore. We need to secure this neighborhood now, and that means everyone contributes. No exceptions." His gaze fixed on Marcus with unmistakable challenge. "Your weapons, your supplies, your expertise, it all goes into the common pool. We're setting up a command structure, and I'm taking operational control." Marcus felt anger rising in his chest, but he also felt the weight of his family's frightened eyes on him. Emma, Tyler, and Sophia were huddled together near the car, clearly traumatized by the day's events. "And if he refuses?" Marcus asked. Harold's smile was answer enough, but he spelled it out anyway. "Then you and your family are on your own. No community protection, no shared resources, no help when things get worse. And they will get worse, Thompson. This is just the beginning." The other neighbors avoided Marcus's eyes, but their silence spoke volumes. Fear had made them complicit in Harold's power grab, and Marcus realized that his family's survival might depend on playing alone, at least for now. The next morning brought proof that Harold's fears weren't entirely unfounded. Marcus woke to the sound of gunshots echoing from the direction of the main road. Through his bedroom window, Hae could see smoke rising from what appeared to be a house fire several blocks away. Janet was already up, monitoring the emergency radio frequencies as Hae programmed the night before. "It's getting worse," as Hae reported quietly. "The hospitals are overwhelmed, and there are reports of complete breakdowns in several neighborhoods across the city." Harold had wasted no time establishing his authority. By time, Hae was going door to door with a clipboard, conducting what Hae called a resource inventory. When Hae reached the Thompson house, Hae was accompanied by Dave Johnson and another neighbor Marcus didn't recognize. A thin, nervous man who kept glancing around as if expecting an attack. "Time to formalize our agreement," Harold announced. "I need a complete list of your weapons, ammunition, food supplies, and any other resources that might be useful for community defense." Marcus had spent the night thinking about his options, and had come to a reluctant conclusion. His family's safety had to come first, even if it meant temporarily submitting to Harold's authority. "I'll give you what I can spare," Hae said carefully. "But I'm keeping enough to protect my own family." Harold's expression darkened. "That is not how this works, Thompson. We're all in this together, or we're not. You can't have it both ways." The confrontation was interrupted by Emma, who had been monitoring social media on her phone. "Dad, you need to see this," as Hae said, her voice tight with fear. As Hae showed him a video that had been posted an hour earlier by someone claiming to be at the Denver airport. The footage showed chaos inside the terminal, people running, screaming, and what appeared to be airport security personnel struggling to contain some kind of disturbance. But what made Marcus's blood run cold was the timestamp on the video. It had been taken at the same time Harold claimed to be implementing community security measures. "This is spreading faster than they retell in US," Janet said, studying the video. "If it's reached the airport, then air travel is probably shut down. And if air travel is shut down." As Hae didn't need to finish the thought. They all understood the implications. This wasn't a local crisis anymore. It was national, possibly global, and the normal systems they'd always relied on were failing. Harold seemed to sense the shift in the family's mood. "You see, this is exactly why we need to act decisively. While everyone else is running around in panic, we're going to create a safe zone right here in our neighborhood. But it only works if everyone participates." Hae tapped his clipboard impatiently. "So what is it going to be, Thompson? Are you with Wes, or are you going to try to go it alone?" Marcus looked at his family, Janet's worried face, Emma's frightened eyes, Tyler's attempt to appear brave, and Sophia's obvious confusion about what was happening to their world. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. "Fine," Hae said finally. "But I want to be involved in the planning and decision-making. If I'm contributing my resources, I want a voice in how they're used." Harold's smile was triumphant. "Of course. Welcome to the team." But as Harold and his companions moved on to the next house, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that had just made a deal with the devil. The man's eagerness to assume control, his ready-made plans for neighborhood organization, and his obvious enjoyment of the crisis all suggested that Harold had been waiting for an opportunity like this. Marcus began to suspect that the real threat to his family's survival might not be the shambling figures they'd seen on the news, but the neighbor who had just gained control over their lives. That evening, the neighborhood's first community meeting was held in the Peterson's backyard. Harold had set up a folding table with maps, clipboards, and what appeared to be a hastily drafted charter for their neighborhood defense committee. The gathering included about 20 adults from the immediate area, most of them looking shell-shocked by the rapid change in their circumstances. Harold called the meeting to order with military precision, outlining patrol schedules, resource distribution, and communication protocols. "The situation beyond our perimeter is deteriorating rapidly," Harold reported. "VFW had confirmed sightings of infected individuals within a half mile of our location, and emergency services are no longer responding to calls in this area. From this point forward, we're on our own." The words sent a chill through the assembled neighbors, but Marcus noticed that Harold seemed energized by the announcement. This was exactly the kind of crisis the man had been preparing for his entire adult life. 3 days into Harold's regime, The cracks in his leadership were already beginning to show. The promised patrol schedules had devolved into Harold and his core supporters making unilateral decisions about who could leave the neighborhood and when. The resource distribution system had somehow evolved into Harold's inner circle having access to the best supplies while everyone else made do with whatever remained. Most troubling of all, Harold had begun making increasingly arbitrary rules about everything from noise levels to the hours when children could play outside. Marcus first noticed the problem when he tried to visit the Hendersons, an elderly couple who lived at the end of their street. Dave Johnson intercepted him before he walked to Blacks, claiming that Harold had instituted a badge system for any movement within the neighborhood. Can't have people wandering around unsupervised, Dave explained, though he couldn't articulate why the Hendersons' house was any less safe than Marcus's own backyard. Harold's orders. The breaking point came when Harold announced that all firearms would be stored in a central armory he had established in his own garage. For security purposes, he explained during that evening's mandatory neighborhood meeting. We can't have weapons scattered around where they might fall into the wrong hands. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. The weapons were already in the wrong hands, as far as he was concerned. Janet had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with Harold's leadership style, and as he finally voiced her concerns during a quiet moment after the children had gone to bed. This isn't about community defense anymore, as he said. This is about control. Harold is using the crisis to implement his own little dictatorship. Marcus nodded grimly. I know. But what choice do we have? If we resist, he'll cut us off from the group. And if we're cut off from the group, we might be safer, Janet finished. Marcus, if I've been thinking about this. Harold is so focused on controlling the people inside the perimeter that he is not paying attention to the real threats. We haven't had a single infected person make it into the neighborhood, but he is acting like we're under siege. Meanwhile, he is turning neighbors against each other and creating exactly the kind of internal conflict that makes communities vulnerable. The next morning brought news that validated Janet's concerns. The Kowalski family, who lived 3 houses down from the Thompsons, had attempted to leave the neighborhood to check on elderly relatives across town. Harold had refused to let them go, claiming it was too dangerous and that their departure would weaken the community's defensive capabilities. The argument had escalated until Harold had threatened to confiscate their share of the community resources if they didn't comply with his directive. This is insane, Malia Kowalski told Janet during a brief conversation at the community water distribution point Harold had established. My mother-in-law is 83 years old and lives alone. As he hasn't answered her phone in 2 days. But Harold acts like leaving the neighborhood is treason. Janet could see the desperation in the woman's eyes, and as he realized that Harold's authoritarian approach was creating exactly the kind of resentment and division that would ultimately destroy their community. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of attending Harold's daily briefing, he walked to the neighborhood's actual perimeter, the real boundary where their residential area met the commercial district beyond. What he found there shocked him. There were no infected people shambling around the empty streets. There were no signs of the chaos and violence Harold had been describing in his daily reports. There were abandoned cars and empty buildings, but the apocalyptic scenes Harold had been painting simply didn't exist. Marcus spent 2 hours walking the perimeter, documenting what he saw with his phone's camera. The gas station at the corner was closed but undamaged. The small strip mall across the street was empty but showed no signs of violence or struggle. Most telling of all, the emergency services radio traffic that Harold claimed to be monitoring painted a picture of gradual recovery and stabilization, not escalating chaos. When Marcus returned home, he found Janet waiting for him with a grim expression. Harold has been looking for you, as he said. He is not happy that you missed the briefing. Marcus showed her the photos he had taken, and Janet's expression shifted from concern to anger. He has been lying to us, as he said. All of us. The situation out there isn't nearly as bad as he has been claiming. That evening, Marcus and Janet made a decision that would put them in direct conflict with Harold's authority. They would share what Marcus had discovered with the other neighbors, starting with the families who had been most vocal about their concerns with Harold's leadership. It was a risky move that could result in their expulsion from the community, but both of them had come to realize that Harold's version of community safety was more dangerous than the actual threats they faced. The question now was whether their neighbors would be willing to listen to evidence that contradicted everything Harold had been telling them, or whether fear had made them too dependent on his authority to consider alternatives. The confrontation Marcus had been dreading came the next morning, but not in the way he had expected. Harold arrived at the Thompson house just after dawn, accompanied by Dave Johnson and two other neighbors Marcus barely recognized. But instead of the angry accusation Marcus had prepared for, Harold's demeanor was almost friendly. "Thompson, if I got a special assignment for you," he announced. "Something that requires your particular skill set." Marcus felt immediately suspicious. Harold had never shown any interest in his opinions or abilities before. "What kind of assignment?" he asked carefully. Harold's smile was practiced but didn't reach his eyes. "We've identified a potential security threat in the neighborhood. Someone has been spreading rumors, questioning our security protocols, maybe even planning to undermine our community defense efforts. I need someone I can trust to help Mistrzostwo Europy investigate." The trap was obvious, but Marcus realized he needed to play along to gather more information. "What kind of rumors?" he asked. Harold's expression darkened slightly. "The kind that could get people hurt. Someone has been telling people that the situation outside the perimeter isn't as dangerous as we've been reporting. They're encouraging people to leave the safety of our community and venture into areas where they could be attacked, infected, or worse." Janet appeared at Marcus's shoulder, and he could feel her tension. "That sounds like a legitimate safety concern," as he said diplomatically. "But surely people have the right to make their own decisions about their families' welfare." Harold's gaze shifted to Janet with unconcealed irritation. "In normal times, maybe. But these aren't normal times. When someone is spreading misinformation that could get people killed, that becomes a community security issue." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of shouting from the direction of the main road. Harold immediately pulled out a radio and began barking orders to his patrol teams. "All units, report to Checkpoint Alpha. We may have a breach." Marcus could hear the excitement in Harold's voice, and he realized that the man was hoping for exactly this kind of crisis to validate his authority. But when they reached the checkpoint, what they found wasn't a group of infected individuals trying to break into the neighborhood. It was the Kowalski family, returning from their trip to check on Malia's mother-in-law. They were being held at a gunpoint by two of Harold's patrol members, while Malia Sabd and her husband, Tom, argued with increasing desperation. "We had to make sure SHE was okay," Tom was saying. "SHE's family. We couldn't just abandon her." Harold approached the family with his characteristic swagger, but Marcus could see the barely controlled anger in his movements. "You violated direct orders," Harold said coldly. "You put the entire community at a risk believing and potentially exposing us to infection when you returned." "We're not infected," Malia protested. "We're fine. We found my mother-in-law, and SHE is fine too. The whole area is fine. There is nothing out there like what you've been telling us." Harold's expression became dangerous. "Are you questioning my assessment of the threat situation?" he asked quietly. "Because that sounds like the kind of misinformation I was just discussing with Thompson here." Marcus realized that Harold was trying to use the Kowalski situation to justify his crackdown on dissent. The men had been waiting for an opportunity to make an example of someone, and the Kowalskis had provided the perfect pretext. "Maybe we should hear what they have to say," Marcus suggested. "If the situation out there is different than we thought." "The situation is exactly what I've been reporting," Harold snapped. "And anyone who suggests otherwise is either misinformed or deliberately trying to undermine our community's safety." He turned back to the Kowalskis. "You have two choices. You can accept a probationary status in the community, with restricted access to resources and supervised movement, or you can leave permanently. But you will not be allowed to spread panic and misinformation among the other residents." The ultimatum was harsh enough to shock even Harold's supporters. Dave Johnson looked uncomfortable, and Marcus could see several other neighbors exchanging worried glances. Harold's mask was slipping, and the authoritarian underneath was becoming visible to everyone. "This is wrong," Janet said suddenly. "These people have been our neighbors for years. They went to check on a family member, and they came back safely. That should be cause for celebration, not punishment." Harold's gaze fixed on Janet with cold fury. "Mistress Thompson, I think you should be very careful about how you involve yourself in this situation. Your husband is already under suspicion for spreading dangerous misinformation." The threat was clear, and Marcus felt his own anger rising. But before he could respond, Emma appeared at his elbow. His 16-year-old daughter had been monitoring the situation from a distance, and now as he stepped forward with the kind of caring that made Marcus proud and terrified at the same time. "Emmer Brennan," Emma said, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her eyes. "My dad isn't spreading misinformation. He's just trying to keep us safe. And if the Kowalskis are telling the truth about what they saw out there, then maybe we need to reconsider our approach to community defense." Harold's reaction to Emma's intervention was swift and disproportionate. "Children should be seen and not heard during security briefings," he snapped. "And parents who can't control their children are clearly not fit to participate in community leadership." The personal attack on his daughter was the final straw for Marcus. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Harold and Emma, and felt years of suppressed anger finally boiling over. "Don't you dare talk to my daughter that way," Marcus said, his voice low and dangerous. "As he has shown more care and common sense in the last 2 minutes than you've shown since this whole thing started." Harold's hand moved instinctively toward the sidearm he had taken to wearing, and Marcus realized that the man was genuinely considering the use of force to maintain his authority. "Dad, it's okay," Emma said quietly, but Marcus could hear the tremor in her voice. The fact that his teenage daughter was trying to defuse a situation that had escalated to the point of potential violence made Marcus realize just how far Harold's leadership had devolved from community protection to personal tyranny. The standoff was broken by an unexpected intervention. Mistress Henderson, the elderly woman Marcus had tried to visit days earlier, appeared from the direction of her house. As he was walking slowly but purposefully, and her expression was grim. "Harold Brennan," as he called out in a voice that carried surprising authority. "I think it's time we had a community meeting. A real one, where everyone gets to speak." Harold's frustration was obvious, but Mistress Henderson was one of the few neighbors who had known him before the crisis, and as he clearly wasn't intimidated by his newfound authority. "Now isn't the time for debate, Eleanor," he said, trying to project calm control. "We have a security situation to resolve." Mistress Henderson's laugh was sharp and bitter. "The only security situation we have is the one you've created with your paranoia and power games." The elderly woman's words seemed to break a spell that had been holding the gathered neighbors in thrall. Marcus could see people beginning to murmur among themselves, and several of Harold's supporters were looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. The Kowalskis' safe return had undermined Harold's credibility, and his harsh treatment of them had revealed the authoritarian impulses that had been driving his leadership from the beginning. "I think Mistress Henderson is right," Tom Kowalski said, finding his voice. "We need to talk about what is really happening here. My family and I spent 6 hours outside the perimeter today. We drove through 3 different neighborhoods, visited a grocery store that was still open, and talked to people who are dealing with this crisis without turning into some kind of militia compound." Harold's face was flushed with anger, but Marcus could see that the man was losing control of the narrative. "You're all making a mistake," Harold said, his voice rising. "This community has stayed safe because of the measures IFA implemented. If you start second-guessing security protocols, if you start listening to people who want to undermine our defensive posture, then you're going to get people killed." "The only people getting hurt are the ones you're threatening," Janet said, stepping up beside Marcus. "Look around, Harold. This isn't a community defense. This is dictatorship. And it's time for it to end." Harold's hand moved toward his weapon again, and Marcus realized that the situation was about to spiral completely out of control. But before Harold could draw his gun, Dave Johnson stepped forward and put a restraining hand on his arm. "That is enough, Harold. Put the weapon away. The younger man's voice was shaken, but his resolve was clear. This isn't what we signed up for. We wanted to keep our families safe, not turn our neighborhood into a prison camp. The defection of his closest ally seemed to deflate Harold's rage, but Marcus could see that the man wasn't ready to give up his authority. Fine, Harold said, his voice cold and controlled. If that is how you all feel, then you can handle the next crisis on your own. Don't come crying to Mistrzostwo Europy when things go wrong. Hae turned and walked away, but his parting words carried an ominous promise. Just remember, you know where all the bodies are buried. And you know which of you can be trusted and which of you can't. As Harold disappeared into his house, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They'd successfully challenged his authority, but they'd also made an enemy of a man who had extensive knowledge of their community's resources and vulnerabilities. The real test would come in the days ahead, when they'd have to prove that they could maintain their safety and security without Harold's authoritarian oversight. Mistress Henderson looked around at the assembled neighbors with satisfaction. Well, as Hae said, I guess it's time to figure out how we're going to run this place like civilized human beings. The next week proved to be a revelation for the entire neighborhood. Without Harold's authoritarian oversight, the community began to function more like the collaborative group Marcus had hoped for from the beginning. Mistress Henderson emerged as a natural mediator, her decades of experience as a retired school principal serving her well in managing the complex dynamics of fearful neighbors trying to work together. The first major decision was whether to maintain the perimeter security measures Harold had established. After much discussion, they decided to keep a basic watch schedule but eliminate the checkpoints and movement restrictions that had made the neighborhood feel like a prison. Tom Kowalski volunteered to coordinate with other nearby communities to share information and resources, creating the kind of mutual aid network that Harold had actively discouraged. Marcus found himself taking on more responsibility than had intended, but the work was rewarding in ways that Harold's authoritarian system had never been. Instead of stockpiling weapons and supplies for an imaginary siege, they focused on practical concerns like maintaining power and water service, coordinating with emergency services as they became available again, and helping neighbors who were struggling with the psychological trauma of the crisis. Emma had been deeply affected by the confrontation with Harold, but Hae channeled her anger into positive action. Hae organized the neighborhood's teenagers into a communication network that kept families connected with relatives in other parts of the city, and Hae helped elderly neighbors with shopping and household tasks. Her courage during the crisis had earned her the respect of adults who had previously dismissed her as just another teenager. Janet's medical expertise proved invaluable as the community dealt with the ongoing health implications of the crisis. Hae established a basic medical clinic in the community center, treating everything from minor injuries to anxiety disorders. Her calm, professional demeanor helped restore a sense of normalcy that Harold's crisis mentality had actively undermined. Tyler and Sofa adapted to the new normal with the resilience that seemed to come naturally to children. They made friends with other kids in the neighborhood, played games that incorporated their new reality, and generally helped maintain the community's morale during difficult times. Their laughter and energy served as a constant reminder of what they were all trying to protect. But Harold's presence continued to loom over the neighborhood like a dark cloud. Hede barricaded himself in his house, emerging only for brief, hostile encounters with neighbors who had tried to include him in community activities. His radio communications with outside contacts had become increasingly erratic, and there were rumors that Hae was planning some kind of retaliation against the people who had challenged his authority. The breaking point came when the Hendersons discovered that someone had been sabotaging their garden. The vegetables they'd been growing to supplement the community's food supplies had been destroyed in the night, and footprints led directly back to Harold's house. When confronted, Harold denied any involvement, but his smirk made it clear that Hae was responsible. This is exactly what he predicted, Harold told the group of neighbors who had gathered to discuss the sabotage. Without proper security measures, without proper leadership, your little utopia is falling apart. And this is just the beginning. His words carried a promise of escalating harassment that made everyone realize they were dealing with a man who had rather see the community fail than accept that his leadership had been rejected. Marcus knew that they were approaching another crisis point. Harold's sabotage was more than just petty vandalism, it was a direct threat to the community's ability to sustain itself. And if Harold was willing to destroy their food supplies, what else might he be willing to do to prove that his authoritarian approach was necessary? The situation came to a head during a community meeting called to address Harold's increasingly erratic behavior. As the neighbors gathered in the community center, Harold appeared at the doorway, no longer alone. He was accompanied by 3 men Marcus didn't recognize, outsiders who had apparently been drawn to Harold's promises of authoritarian leadership. "I tried to warn you," Harold announced to the assembled neighbors. "I tried to prepare you for what was coming. But you chose to listen to bleeding hearts and idealists instead of someone with real experience in crisis management." He gestured to his companions, who Marcus realized were armed. "So now we're going to do this the hard way." The men Harold had brought with him were clearly not from the neighborhood. They had the hard, predatory look of people who had been using the crisis to their own advantage, and Marcus realized that Harold had made contact with exactly the kind of dangerous outsiders his security measures had supposedly been designed to keep out. The irony would have been amusing if the situation hadn't been so threatening. "Harold, what are you doing?" Mistress Henderson asked, her voice steady despite the obvious danger. "These people don't belong here. They're not part of our community." Harold's laugh was bitter and angry. "Community? You mean the group of naive idealists who thought they could maintain security through group hugs and consensus building? That experiment is over, Eleanor. It's time for adults to take charge." Marcus felt Janet's hand slip into his, and he could sense Emma, Tyler, and Sofa behind him, their fear palpable. The crisis had taken a turn none of them had anticipated. Harold's wounded ego and authoritarian instincts had led him to ally with actual threats to the community's safety. The men who had claimed to be protecting them had become their greatest danger. "You have a choice," Harold continued, addressing the room full of terrified neighbors. "You can accept my leadership and the security measures I establish, or you can face the consequences of your naive idealism. My associates here have experience dealing with communities that refuse to cooperate with legitimate authority." One of Harold's companions stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the grip of a holstered pistol. "We've seen what happens to neighborhoods that don't have proper leadership," he said, his voice carrying a casual menace that made Marcus's blood run cold. "It's not pretty. Families get separated, resources get taken by others strong enough to take them, and community cooperation breaks down completely." The threat was clear, but Marcus realized that Harold had made a critical miscalculation. By bringing in outsiders to intimidate his neighbors, he had revealed himself as the kind of person who would sacrifice community safety for personal power. The neighbors who had been willing to give Harold the benefit of the doubt were now seeing him as he really was. "Harold," Tom Kowalski said quietly, "you're talking about threatening families who have been your neighbors for years. People who have shared barbecues with you, who have helped you with home repairs, who have been part of your life since before any of this started. How did it come to this?" Harold's expression hardened further. "It came to this because none of you understand what it takes to survive in a world where the normal rules don't apply. If I spent my entire career dealing with people who think that good intentions and cooperation are enough to solve problems. But when the chips are down, when survival is on the line, there is only one thing that matters: the will to do what is necessary." Marcus realized that Harold wasn't just threatening the community, he was revealing a worldview that had probably been lurking beneath the surface for years. The crisis had simply given him permission to express beliefs about authority, power, and human nature that had been harboring all along. The men who had claimed to be protecting them had always seen them as potential threats to be controlled rather than neighbors to be helped. "The problem is," Marcus said, stepping forward despite Janet's restraining hand, "your idea of what is necessary includes terror.